The morning sun rose over Haven Colony like it had every day for the past 12 years, since humans first settled on Kepler 442c, and Director Park Ji-ho stood at his office window watching 2,000 children begin their daily routines in the courtyard below. Some ran around playing tag while others sat in small groups sharing stories and laughs, and a few of the older ones helped the younger children tie their shoes or fix their hair. And Park smiled because this was exactly what he had dreamed of when he first proposed turning this remote world into a sanctuary for war orphans from across human space. These children had lost everything in conflicts that adults had started and adults had failed to end. But here on Haven Colony, they found something new, and Park made sure every single one of them knew they were safe and loved and wanted. Dr. Kim Minji walked into his office carrying her morning coffee and the daily medical reports, and she looked tired but happy, as she always did after checking on the children in the hospital wing. "The children are doing well today, Ji-ho," she said, using his first name, like she had since they became friends 5 years ago when she first arrived on the colony, and two of the kids who came in last week with trauma, nightmares, slept through the night without waking up. Screaming, Park nodded and felt the familiar warmth in his chest that came whenever one of their children took another step toward healing. "And it takes time," he said. "But they get better, and they always get better when they know someone cares about them down in the courtyard." Captain Lee Donghyun walked his morning patrol route and checked the perimeter sensors that kept watch for any threats from space or land. And Lee was a former soldier who had seen too much war, but he found peace in protecting these children and making sure they never had to see what he had seen. He stopped to watch teacher Choi Min-woo leading a group of 8-year-olds in their outdoor science class, and Choi was pointing at the sky and explaining how their new homeworld orbited its star, and the children asked questions about everything, and Choi answered each one with patience and excitement. Among the children was Han Soo-young, who was 12 years old and had arrived 3 years ago after losing her parents in a pirate raid on her home station. And she had been quiet and scared when she first came to Haven Colony. But now she was the natural leader that other children looked up to when they felt lost or afraid. Soo-young helped the younger children with their lessons and organized games during free time and always made sure no one felt left out. And Park often said she had the heart of a teacher and would probably run her own school someday. The colony operated on schedules that gave structure but also flexibility, because every child healed differently, and some needed more time alone, while others needed constant company, and some learned best through books, while others needed hands-on activities, and the staff worked hard to meet every child where they were. In the medical wing, Dr. Kim treated everything from scraped knees to panic attacks, to the deeper wounds that came from losing family too young. And she had trained as both a doctor and a therapist because these children needed both kinds of healing, and she gave both freely. The kitchen staff, led by cook Nam Jinwoo, prepared meals that reminded children of homeworlds they would never see again, and Nam learned recipes from dozens of human colonies, so every child could taste something familiar and comforting when they felt homesick. The workshops run by engineer Yoon Dae-hyun taught older children practical skills like electronics, repair, and hydroponics and mechanical engineering. And Dae-hyun believed that learning to build and fix things helped children feel capable and confident again after trauma had made them feel powerless. Every adult on Haven Colony had volunteered to come here, and many had turned down better-paying jobs elsewhere because they believed in what Park was building. And they knew these children deserved more than just basic care, and they deserved to feel valued and important and loved. The colony received supplies and funding from human governments across known space, but it also got donations from private citizens who heard about the work being done here and wanted to help, and sometimes entire school classes from other worlds would send care packages with toys and books and letters telling the Haven Colony children that they mattered. Park kept every letter in his office files, because someday when these children were grown, they might want to remember that strangers cared enough to reach out. And the letters proved that humanity at its best was about taking care of each other, especially those who needed help most. But Park also knew that not everyone in the galaxy shared human values about protecting the innocent, and the reports from military intelligence showed that aggressive alien species were expanding their territories, and some of them had very different ideas about strength and weakness. The Thrakari Empire was one such species, and their philosophy centered on conquest through superior force, and they viewed compassion as a character flaw that made other species easy targets. And recent intelligence suggested they were planning major military operations in this sector of space. Captain Lee received these reports and updated the colony defense systems. But Haven Colony was never meant to be a military target, and the defensive weapons were designed to handle pirates and raiders, not a full-scale invasion fleet. And everyone hoped the colony, remote location and obvious humanitarian mission would keep it safe from larger conflicts. The children knew nothing about these concerns, and they continued their daily routines of learning and playing and slowly healing from past traumas, and in the afternoons they had art therapy sessions where they drew pictures of their dreams for the future. And many drew pictures of families they wanted to have someday, or jobs they wanted to do, or places they wanted to visit. Teacher Choi often said that hope was the most important lesson they could teach, and every child who learned to dream again was a victory against the forces that had tried to break them. And when children who had been silent for months finally started talking, or when kids who had nightmares finally started sleeping peacefully, it proved that love could overcome even the worst experiences. Dr. Kim kept detailed records of each child progress, not just for medical reasons, but because she wanted to document how healing happened, and maybe someday her research would help other traumatized children in other places. And she believed that every small breakthrough at Haven Colony could eventually help children across human space. The evening routine was always the same, and after dinner the younger children gathered in the main hall for story time, while older kids worked on homework or pursued hobbies, and some learned musical instruments while others painted or wrote in journals, and a few worked on coding projects or studied advanced mathematics. Park made it a point to visit every dormitory before bedtime, and he would stop at each bed to say goodnight and listen to any concerns or excitement the children wanted to share, and sometimes a child would ask about their parents or their old home, and Park would listen and help them process those feelings without judgment. Soo-young often helped with bedtime routines, and she had a gift for knowing exactly what each younger child needed to feel safe, and some needed extra blankets while others wanted someone to check under their beds for monsters, and some just needed to know that an adult would be nearby all night. The night shift staff, led by Nurse Oh Sungmin, kept watch while the children slept, and they walked quiet rounds through the dormitories and responded to nightmares or requests for water or bathroom trips, and Oh often said that protecting children while they slept was the most important job in the universe. As Park finally returned to his quarters each night, he would look out at the stars and think about all the children sleeping safely under his protection. And he thought about the families they had lost and the trauma they had survived, and the hope they were building for their futures. And he felt proud of what they had accomplished here. But tonight something felt different, and the long-range sensors had detected unusual activity at the edge of the system, and Captain Lee had reported strange energy signatures that suggested a large fleet might be approaching, and military command had been contacted. But Haven Colony was so far from any major human bases that help would take days to arrive. Park tried to push away his worries because the children needed him to be calm and confident, and tomorrow would bring new lessons and new small victories and new steps toward healing. And he refused to let fear overshadow the good work they were doing. The morning would come, and the children would wake up and begin another day of learning to trust and hope and dream again, and that was what mattered most. And whatever challenges lay ahead, Park knew that the love and dedication of the Haven Colony staff would see them through. He closed his eyes and tried to sleep while 2,000 children rested peacefully under his protection, and somewhere in the distance sensors continued to track approaching ships that moved with purpose toward their small sanctuary among the stars. The alarm started screaming at dawn, and Captain Lee Dong-hyun ran to the command center while children throughout Haven Colony woke up confused and frightened by sounds they had never heard before. And Director Park Ji-ho arrived minutes later, still putting on his jacket and demanding to know what was happening. "The sensors show a massive fleet dropping out of hyperspace at the edge of our system," Lee said, and his face was grim as he pointed at the tactical display and 37 ships, including at least 12 heavy cruisers and multiple troop transports, and they are broadcasting Thrakari military codes. Park felt ice form in his stomach, because everyone knew the Thrakari reputation for brutality, and their belief that mercy was weakness, and their fleets did not travel this far from their territory unless they planned conquest and total destruction. Open a communication channel, Park ordered, and maybe we can make them understand what we are. The main screen flickered to life and showed the bridge of a Thrakari warship, and Admiral Vextar appeared with his scaled skin and 4 arms, and the cold yellow eyes that showed no emotion, and behind him, other Thrakari officers stood at attention, while weapons displays showed the firepower aimed at Haven Colony. We are Admiral Vextar of the Thrakari Third Fleet, and you will surrender your world immediately, or face complete annihilation. Director Park stepped forward and tried to keep his voice steady. And Admiral, we are a humanitarian colony, and we house orphan children from across human space, and we have no military value and no strategic importance, and we ask that you respect our non-combatant status. The Admiral laughed, and it was a sound like metal. Scraping against stone and human weakness disgusts us, and your practice of caring for genetic failures only proves your species deserves extinction, and we will begin with this pathetic display of sentiment. But these are children, Park said, and his voice rose despite his efforts to stay calm, and they have done nothing wrong, and they have already lost their families, and their parents died in wars they never chose. And please just look at what we have built. Here Park activated the colony cameras and showed the Admiral images of children in classrooms and children playing in courtyards and children working together in the gardens, and he showed the medical facilities where traumatized young ones learn to trust again, and the workshops where teenagers built projects with hope for their futures. Look at them, Park pleaded, and these children represent the best of what any species can become, and they are learning to heal and to dream and to build something better than the wars that orphaned them, and surely even warriors can see the value in protecting innocence. Admiral Vextar watched the images with obvious disgust, and weakness breeding more weakness, he said, and your children will grow up to spread this pathetic philosophy of mercy and compassion, and the galaxy will be better when this infection is burned away. The communication cut off, and immediately the Thrakari fleet began moving toward Haven Colony, and Captain Lee activated every defensive system the colony possessed, but everyone knew it would not be enough, and the orbital platforms had weapons designed to stop pirates and raiders, not a military fleet bent on genocide. Dr. Kim Minji burst into the command center. And what can I do to help? And how many children can we evacuate? Park looked at the tactical display and calculated the impossible mathematics of salvation. And we have 6 transport ships with a total capacity of 400 people. Including crew, and the Thrakari fleet will be in weapons, range in 3 hours, and there is no way to save them all. But we have to try, Lee said, and he was already organizing the evacuation, and the youngest children first, and then anyone with medical needs, and we keep loading until the last possible second throughout. The colony staff members ran to their assigned positions, and teacher Choi Min-woo gathered children in the main hall and tried to explain what was happening without causing panic. And some of the older children, like Han Soo-young, immediately understood and began helping to organize the younger ones. Cook Nam Jin-woo filled emergency supply containers with food and water, while engineer Yoon Dae-hyun powered up the transport ships and ran system checks, and nurse Oh Sung-min prepared medical supplies and trauma kits because they all knew some children would be hurt badly before this was over. The first transport launched with 87 children and 12 staff members, and Park watched it disappear into the sky and felt his heart break, knowing he was sending some children to safety while leaving others behind to die. And there was no fair way to choose who lived and who died, and so they chose based on age and medical need, and tried not to think about the rest. Soo-young found Park as the second transport was loading, and Director, I want to help with the evacuation, and I can keep the little ones calm and make sure they get on the ships. You need to be on that ship. Park told her, and you are still a child yourself, and you deserve a chance to live, but the younger ones are scared and they trust me, and someone needs to stay with them until the end. Soo-young said, and her voice was steady but her hands shook, and I am not leaving them alone. The third and fourth transports launched. As the Thrakari fleet moved closer, and Captain Lee reported that enemy ships were jamming communications and preventing any calls for help from reaching human military forces, and the colony was completely cut off and facing annihilation alone. Dr. Kim worked frantically in the medical center, trying to sedate the most traumatized children so they would not suffer fear in their final moments, and she injected herself with stimulants to keep working even as tears ran down her face, and she knew that her medical training had never prepared her for anything like this. The fifth transport had mechanical problems, and Engineer Yoon crawled through maintenance tunnels, trying to fix the engines, while explosions from Thrakari scout ships began falling around the colony, and the defensive platforms returned fire but were quickly destroyed, and burning debris rained down on the dormitories. Teacher Choi led a group of children who had not made it onto transports into the reinforced basement of the school building, and he told them stories about brave heroes and magical kingdoms while the ceiling shook from enemy fire, and some children cried while others sat in stunned silence, and all of them looked to him for comfort. He could not give. The fifth transport finally launched with 93 children and 8 staff members, but the sixth transport was destroyed on the landing pad by a direct hit from a Thrakari energy cannon, and everyone on board died instantly, including 42 children and 6 adults who had volunteered to stay behind until the N-Park stood in the command center, watching the tactical display as 37 enemy ships moved into bombardment formation, and Captain Lee reported that their remaining weapons had been destroyed and they had no way to fight back and no way to protect the children still on the ground. The bombardment began with methodical precision, and the Thrakari targeted the dormitories first, where most of the remaining children were hiding, and the buildings that had been filled with laughter and learning and healing were reduced to burning rubble in minutes, and small bodies were buried under tons of concrete, and Steel Dr. Kim died when the medical center was hit while she was treating injured children, and she had been trying to carry a 6-year-old girl to safety when the building collapsed, and both of them were found later in each other's arms, and the girl was still clutching the toy rabbit that Dr. Kim had given her teacher Choi was found in the school basement surrounded by the bodies of 19 children, and he had used his own body to shield them from falling debris. But it had not been enough, and his last act had been to keep telling them a story about a magical place where no one ever got hurt and everyone lived happily ever after. Engineer Yoon survived long enough to send an automated distress signal before a Thrakari bomber destroyed the communications array, and his message contained sensor logs and visual records of the attack. And his final words were a promise that someone would remember what happened here and make the Thrakari pay Han Soo-young had refused to board any transport and instead stayed in the main dormitory, helping younger children stay calm as explosions got closer. And she was found later holding the hands of twin brothers who had arrived at Haven Colony just 2 weeks earlier, and all 3 had died when the dormitory roof collapsed. The final transport managed to escape with 47 children and 12 adults, including Director Park, who had been forcibly carried aboard by Captain Lee. And as their ship limped away from the burning colony, Park watched through the rear viewport as Thrakari ships systematically destroyed every structure and eliminated any sign that Haven Colony had ever existed. The casualty reports were devastating, and 1,653 children had died along with 89 adult staff members, and the few survivors were traumatized beyond measure. And Park knew that the images of burning dormitories and dead children would haunt him for whatever remained of his life, as their damaged transports struggled toward human space. Park activated the emergency communication system and sent a message to Earth Fleet Command, and his voice was hollow and broken as he spoke. And they bombed a human orphanage, and they killed defenseless children who had already lost everything. And God help us, all for what we are about to become. The message spread across human space within hours, and images of Haven Colony burning reached every human world, and every human colony, and every human ship. And the reaction? Well, the news reached Earth 36 hours after the massacre, and Admiral Song Tae-hyun was in a meeting with the Defense Council when his aide burst through the doors with tears streaming down her face. And Admiral, you need to see this right now. And she activated the holographic display and showed him the images from Haven Colony. Burning dormitories filled the screen, and rescue teams pulled small bodies from the rubble, and Director Park voice played over the footage describing how the Thrakari had deliberately targeted children after being shown exactly what Haven Colony was, and the images showed teddy bears burned beyond recognition, and classroom walls covered with children artwork now stained with blood. Admiral Song had commanded fleets through 3 major conflicts and had seen the worst that warfare could offer. but his hands shook as he watched footage of a 6-year-old girl toys scattered around her body. And he felt something break inside his chest, and something else take its place that was harder and colder, and infinitely more dangerous, within. 6 hours every human world had received the transmission, and the reaction was immediate and unprecedented. And on Earth, massive crowds gathered outside government buildings demanding immediate military action, and on Mars colonists, who had never owned weapons, began signing up for military service, and throughout human spaceships that had carried cargo and passengers began retrofitting for War General Bay. Suman activated the emergency mobilization protocols that had never been used in peacetime, and every human military unit, regardless of location, received orders to prepare for total war, and reservists were called back to active duty, and civilian ships were requisitioned for military use, and weapons factories that had been producing farming equipment suddenly switched to making instruments of death. The response was unlike anything in human history, and even the most peaceful colonies that had not produced soldiers in generations began training armies and research. Stations that focused on medicine and agriculture pivoted overnight to weapons development, and religious communities that preached nonviolence sent every able-bodied adult to volunteer for combat duty. Yoon Jisoo had spent her career developing medical technologies and agricultural improvements, but when she saw the images from Haven Colony, she immediately requested transfer to the Prometheus Military Research Division, and her first words to her new commander were simple: "And how do I help kill them all?" The Prometheus facility became a hive of activity as researchers who had dedicated their lives to helping humanity suddenly focused their brilliance on destroying the Thrakari, projects that had been abandoned as too dangerous were resurrected and improved, and weapons that humanity had sworn never to use were pulled from storage and made ready. Captain Shin Yoonji volunteered for the most dangerous assignment available and requested command of an experimental stealth ship that could penetrate enemy space undetected, and her psychological evaluation noted that she showed signs of deep emotional trauma from viewing the Haven Colony footage, but her skills were needed, and her motivation was beyond question. Colonel Nam Hyun-woo led a special forces unit that normally handled hostage rescue and counterterrorism, but they immediately began training for a different mission entirely: an assassination and sabotage and psychological warfare, and the kind of operations that were designed not just to win battles but to break enemy morale completely. Across human space, the mobilization continued with efficiency that surprised even military planners, and civilians volunteered for everything from ship construction to ammunition production to medical support, and children too young to fight collected scrap metal for recycling, and elderly citizens who had lived through previous wars shared their knowledge with new recruits. The Thrakari Empire monitored human communications and initially dismissed the reaction as typical emotional outbursts that would fade once the reality of warfare became clear, and their intelligence analysts reported that humans had always been reluctant warriors who followed rules of engagement and worried about civilian casualties, and they expected a limited response that could be easily countered. Admiral Vextar himself submitted a report claiming that the destruction of Haven Colony would serve as an effective deterrent, and that humans would avoid future conflicts rather than risk similar losses. And he recommended continuing the expansion into human territory, because their weak response proved they lacked the will for serious warfare. But intelligence reports from Thrakari spies embedded in human space began telling a different story, and humans were not behaving like a species preparing for limited conflict, and they were mobilizing every resource for total war. And children were learning to build weapons. Instead of playing games, and entire industries were converting to military production. General Bay received these intelligence reports and smiled for the first time since seeing the Haven Colony footage. "And let them underestimate us," she told her staff, "and let them think we are still the same humans. They thought they could intimidate, and they will learn otherwise soon enough." The transformation was happening at every level of human society, and pacifist philosophers who had preached non-violence for decades published essays explaining why the Thrakari threat required suspension of normal moral constraints, and university students who had studied literature and art began learning tactics and logistics and combat engineering. Dr. Yoon team worked 18-hour days developing weapons systems that pushed the boundaries of scientific ethics and nanite swarms that could target specific genetic markers and viral agents that caused systematic organ failure and gravitational weapons that could destabilize entire star systems, and each breakthrough brought them closer to capabilities that would have horrified them 6 months earlier. Admiral Song began assembling the largest human fleet ever constructed, and not just warships but specialized vessels designed for planetary bombardment and atmospheric processing, and the complete destruction of enemy infrastructure. And the fleet would include weapons that humanity had developed but never deployed because they violated every treaty on civilized warfare. But treaties were written by species that had never murdered human children, and Admiral Song authorized the deployment of planet crackers and atmospheric destroyers and quantum bombs that could turn entire worlds into lifeless rocks. And when his staff questioned the ethics of such weapons, he showed them the footage from Haven Colony and asked if they thought the Thrakari deserved any consideration. The mobilization included psychological preparation, as well as military training, and human soldiers watched the Haven Colony footage repeatedly until they became numb to images of dead children, and until their grief transformed into something much more useful for warfare and training programs, focused on eliminating hesitation and mercy, and any tendency to see Thrakari as beings deserving of consideration. Captain Shin tested her stealth ship systems and practiced infiltration techniques while her crew learned to deploy biological weapons and nanite swarms with surgical precision, and their mission would be to penetrate Thrakari space and demonstrate that nowhere was safe from human revenge, and that every Thrakari world could become a target kernel. NAM Special Forces teams trained in methods that went far beyond conventional military tactics, and they learned to target Thrakari leadership with precision strikes and to use psychological warfare techniques that would break enemy morale, and they practiced making examples that would terrify entire populations into submission. The civilian population supported the war effort with enthusiasm that military leaders found both encouraging and disturbing, and parents who had protested military spending now donated their savings to weapons research, and teachers who had educated children about peace now trained them to identify enemy weak points. And everyone understood that this was not a war for territory or resources, but for the very survival of human values. Religious leaders across human space held services to bless the war effort, and prayers were offered not for victory, but for the strength to do what was necessary. And sermons explained why mercy toward child killers was itself a sin, and why the complete destruction of the Thrakari was a moral imperative that transcended normal ethical constraints. The industrial mobilization produced weapons and ships at a rate that shocked even optimistic projections, and automated factories worked continuously, while human workers volunteered for extended shifts and quality control systems were streamlined, because speed mattered more than perfection, and the enemy needed to die quickly and completely. As the months passed, human space transformed into something unrecognizable, and worlds that had been known for art and culture became military production centers, and universities that had taught philosophy and literature became training grounds for officers, and research facilities that had pursued knowledge, for its own sake, focused entirely on creating better ways to kill Thrakari. Dr. Yoon team achieved breakthrough after breakthrough, and developed weapons that could target Thrakari biology specifically, while leaving other species unharmed, and created nanite swarms that would seek out Thrakari genetic markers and destroy them cell by cell, and perfected viral agents that would cause slow and painful death while leaving the victim conscio. 6 months after the Haven Colony massacre, Admiral Song Tae-hyun stood before the assembled human fleet and delivered the order that would change the galaxy forever. And there will be no negotiations, and no terms, and no mercy. And the Thrakari Empire will cease to exist, and every world they have claimed will be cleansed, and every citizen will pay the price for their species' crimes. The first phase began with Captain Shin Yoonji stealth ships penetrating deep into Thrakari territory while remaining completely undetected by enemy sensors, and her ships carried Dr. Yoon nanite swarms, specifically designed to target Thrakari genetic markers, and the deployment was surgical and silent, and absolutely lethal on the military world of Keth Prime 2. Million Thrakari soldiers simply stopped moving during their morning formation, and they remained conscious and aware as the nanites began systematically shutting down their nervous systems, and the process took hours and allowed each soldier to understand exactly what was happening to them and why. The nanites worked by targeting the specific proteins that controlled Thrakari muscle function, and the soldiers could see and hear and think, but could not move or speak or call for help, and they lay paralyzed in formation, while automated systems recorded their biological functions failing one by one, and the recordings were broadcast across Thrakari communication networks. Colonel Nam Hyun-woo. Special Forces teams materialized on 17 different Thrakari worlds simultaneously, and their targets were not military installations but the homes and offices of high-ranking officials, and the assassinations were designed to send a message that nowhere was safe and that human reach extended everywhere. Admiral Graktha of the Thrakari Second Fleet was found dead in his private quarters, despite being surrounded by elite bodyguards, and the security systems showed no signs of intrusion and no evidence of how the humans had penetrated the most secure facility on the planet, and his body showed signs of torture that lasted for hours before death provided release. General Vexkor was discovered in his command bunker 3 kilometers underground and sealed behind multiple layers of security, and he had been skinned alive with surgical precision and left conscious until the final moments, and a message was carved into the wall beside his body that read, "For the children of Haven Colony," in perfect Thrakari script. The psychological warfare campaign expanded as Colonel Nam teams began leaving evidence of their presence without actually killing their targets, and Thrakari officials would wake to find human messages in their private spaces and photos of their families with targeting symbols overlaid and countdown timers showing how long they had left to live. The terror spread through Thrakari leadership as they realized that human special forces could reach anyone, anywhere, at any time, and military commanders began sleeping in different locations each night, and political leaders surrounded themselves with multiple security details, and none of it mattered because the humans had capabilities that defied Thrakari understanding. But the true horror began when Admiral Songmain Fleet arrived at the outer systems of Thrakari space, and the humans did not target military installations or strategic resources, and instead, they focused on civilian population centers with weapons that turned warfare into something unrecognizable. The agricultural world of Teth Minor housed 40 million Thrakari civilians who had never participated in military actions, and the human fleet arrived in orbit and broadcast a single message. "And this is for the children you murdered," and then began systematic bombardment of every city and town and farming community. The bombardment did not use conventional weapons, and instead atmospheric processors were deployed in reverse configuration, and the planet air began changing composition as oxygen levels dropped and toxic compounds increased, and the Thrakari population had time to understand what was happening, but no way to stop it or escape. Rescue ships that tried to evacuate civilians were targeted by human fighters and destroyed without warning, and transport vessels loaded with families were vaporized by weapons that left no debris, and the message was clear that there would be no escape and no mercy and no consideration for innocence or non-combatant status on the industrial world of Crack 7. The human fleet deployed gravitational weapons that destabilized the planetary core, and massive earthquakes shook the world continuously, while volcanic eruptions covered the sky with ash, and the Thrakari population faced a slow death as their world literally came apart beneath their feet. The few Thrakari who managed to broadcast messages begging for mercy received identical responses from Admiral Song, and "Your species showed no mercy to our children, and we extend you the same courtesy." And the communications were then cut permanently as human jammers prevented any further attempts at contact. Dr. Yoon nanite swarms were deployed on worlds that had large civilian populations, and the nanites were programmed to distinguish between adult and juvenile Thrakari, and adult targets experienced slow system failure over days or weeks while juveniles died quickly and painlessly. And when asked about this distinction, Dr. Yoon explained that human children had been given no such mercy. The systematic destruction continued as the human fleet moved through Thrakari space like a plague, and every world they visited was left lifeless, and every population center was reduced to rubble, and every trace of Thrakari civilization was eliminated with methodical thoroughness. General Bay intelligence teams provided targeting information that went far beyond military necessity, and cultural sites that held religious or historical significance were destroyed first. To break Thrakari morale, and breeding facilities were targeted with biological weapons that ensured no future generations could be born, and ancient monuments that celebrated Thrakari achievements were vaporized to eliminate any source of species. The psychological impact on surviving Thrakari was devastating, and intercepted communications showed increasing panic and desperation as their military leaders realized they faced an enemy that followed no conventional rules of warfare and that negotiated no settlements and accepted no surrenders and offered no quarter under any circumstances. Thrakari Admiral Zektar attempted to contact Admiral Song directly and offered complete surrender of all military forces and payment of massive reparations and permanent withdrawal from human space, and the response came in the form of biological weapons deployed on Zektar homeworld that killed every living thing, including his own family. The few Thrakari ships that attempted to flee were hunted down by human forces and destroyed regardless of whether they carried military personnel or civilian refugees, and Captain Shin's stealth vessels pursued fleeing ships across multiple star systems and eliminated them with weapons that left no survivors and no evidence of what had killed them. Human forces demonstrated capabilities that terrified other alien species who observed the conflict, and weapons that could destabilize stars and turn them into nova events and nanite swarms that could consume entire ecosystems, and biological agents that could eliminate specific species while leaving others untouched. The doctrine of absolute war meant that no Thrakari installation was too small to target, and no population was too remote to reach, and research stations and agricultural facilities and even isolated outposts were systematically located and destroyed. And the humans demonstrated infinite patience and resources in hunting down every trace of Thrakari presence on the fortress world of Drak Prime. The human fleet encountered the largest Thrakari military formation ever assembled, and 3,000 warships, and orbital defense platforms, and planetary shields that had never been penetrated, and the battle lasted 14 minutes before the entire Thrakari force was eliminated, and the planet's surface was then sterilized from orbit. The speed and efficiency of human victory shocked observers throughout the galaxy, and species that had considered humanity weak and emotional realized they had completely misunderstood human nature. And that compassion was not weakness, but a choice that could be revoked when circumstances demanded it. Admiral Song received daily reports of Thrakari worlds rendered lifeless, and populations eliminated and military forces destroyed. And he felt no satisfaction from these victories because they were not victories in any traditional sense, and they were executions carried out on a galactic scale, and the systematic elimination of an entire species. Dr. Yoon continued developing new weapon systems even as the war neared its conclusion, and she created viral agents that could survive in space and infect any Thrakari who might be hiding in remote locations, and nanite swarms that could remain dormant for decades and activate when they detected Thrakari genetic material. And her goal was to ensure that no members of the species could survive to rebuild. The transformation of human military doctrine was complete, and rules of engagement had been replaced by rules of extermination, and concepts like proportional response and civilian protection had been abandoned in favor of total destruction. And the military officers who carried out these orders showed no emotion, and no hesitation, and no doubt about the righteousness of their cause. Colonel Nam's special forces had evolved from elite soldiers into something resembling a death cult, and they took pride in their ability to reach any target and eliminate any threat, and their psychological profiles showed complete compartmentalization of normal human empathy when dealing with Thrakari targets, and they had become precisely the kind of issue. 2 years after the Haven Colony massacre, the Thrakari Empire no longer existed, and their homeworlds were lifeless rocks drifting through space, and their colonies had been sterilized, and their fleets destroyed, and the few survivors lived in hiding aboard damaged ships in the emptiest regions of space, and they numbered perhaps a few thousand out of a species that had once claimed billions. Admiral Song Tai-hyun stood before the Galactic Council and delivered his final report on what military historians were already calling the war of human vengeance, and total strategic objectives achieved, and no human military casualties in the final 18 months of operations, and complete elimination of Thrakari military capacity and civilization. But when the Altarian ambassador asked if he was proud of humanity, victory, Admiral Song was quiet for a long moment before answering. And we did not win a war, and we committed genocide, and we became something we swore we would never become. And the children of Haven Colony deserve justice, but I am not certain they would have wanted this. The other alien delegates listened in uncomfortable silence because they had all monitored the human campaign and witnessed weapons and tactics that defied every convention of civilized warfare. And they had seen entire species eliminated with efficiency that made their own military forces seem primitive. And they understood that humanity had revealed capabilities that changed everything. Director Park Ji-ho visited the memorial, built where Haven Colony had once stood, and the black stone monument contained the names of 1,653 children, carved with perfect precision, and at the base a simple inscription read, "They were innocent, and they were ours, and we failed them, and we will not fail again." Park stood alone among the ruins and read each name aloud because someone needed to remember them as individuals rather than statistics, and Han Soo-young, who had refused evacuation to help younger children, and Kim Taemin, who had loved building model starships, and Oh Naeun, who had wanted to become a doctor, like Dr. Kim Min-ji, and hundreds of others who had dreamed of futures that would never come. The memorial received visitors from across human space, and parents brought their children to see what had been lost and what had been avenged, and many left flowers and toys and letters, promising that the Haven Colony children would never be forgotten, and the site became a pilgrimage destination for humans who needed to understand what they had become. Dr. Yoon Ji-soo Research Division was quietly disbanded and their weapons sealed away in facilities that would remain classified for centuries, but the knowledge remained, and everyone understood that humanity had crossed lines that could never be uncrossed, and the weapons existed, and the willingness to use them had been proven, and future enemies would have to consider that reality. Captain Shin Yoon-ji returned to civilian life, but struggled with nightmares about the missions she had carried out. And in her dreams, she saw Thrakari families running from the weapons she had deployed, and children who looked remarkably like human children trying to hide from nanite swarms that hunted them with relentless precision. And she sought counseling but found that no therapist could help her process what she had become. Colonel Nam Hyun-woo simply disappeared one day, and his quarters were found empty, except for a single note that read, "Some wars end, and some warriors do not get to come home," and search teams never found any trace of him, and many believed he had chosen to exile himself, rather than try to return to a normal life after what he had done. The human military underwent massive restructuring as leaders tried to process what their forces had accomplished, and training programs were revised to include extensive psychological support, and weapons research was redirected toward defensive systems, and many officers requested transfers to non-combat roles because they could not reconcile their actions with their values. General Bae Suman supervised the destruction of captured Thrakari technology and databases, and every trace of their civilization was catalogued and then eliminated to ensure that their philosophy of conquest through brutality could never influence other species. And she worked methodically through lists of targets until nothing remained of Thrakari culture, except archived records in human intelligence files. The transformation of human society proved difficult to reverse, and industries that had focused on weapons production struggled to convert back to civilian purposes, and workers who had spent 2 years building instruments of death found it challenging to return to creating art and literature and peaceful technologies. And the skills learned during wartime were not easily forgotten. Educational systems across human space grappled with how to teach children about the war and how to explain that their civilization had committed genocide while maintaining that human values still mattered, and that mercy and compassion remained important even after they had been abandoned when circumstances demanded it. And the contradictions were difficult for young minds to process. Religious leaders held countless services attempting to address the spiritual implications of what humanity had done, and some argued that the complete destruction of the Thrakari was morally justified as protection for future innocence, and others maintained that genocide was always wrong, regardless of provocation, and the debates continued. without resolution because both sides had valid points. Other alien civilizations began treating humanity with a mixture of respect and terror, and diplomatic negotiations took on new dynamics when everyone understood that humans possessed both. The weapons and the demonstrated willingness to eliminate entire species in trade agreements and territorial disputes were resolved much more quickly when humanity expressed interest in the outcomes. The Zephyrian Empire issued a formal apology for past conflicts with human colonies, and the Crystalline Collective offered significant territorial concessions in exchange for guaranteed peaceful relations, and the Vorthan Republic requested formal alliance agreements and provided detailed intelligence about their enemies as proof of good faith. But the most significant change was in how other species viewed human nature, and the galaxy had learned that human compassion was not weakness, but a choice that could be revoked. And that, beneath their peaceful exterior, humans possessed capacity for systematic brutality that exceeded anything previously documented. And the lesson was learned by every civilization with enough intelligence to understand the implications. A meeting of the Galactic Council addressed humanity membership for the first time, and the alien delegates were respectful and even deferential as they discussed terms, but every alien in the room was thinking the same thought. And these beings loved their children so much that when someone killed them, they became the most terrifying force in known space. And what would they do to protect their entire species? The human representative spoke about peace and cooperation and mutual prosperity, and the words were sincere because humanity genuinely preferred peaceful solutions, but everyone present understood that peace was humanity's first choice and not their only option, and that behind every diplomatic smile lay the knowledge of what humans could become when pushed beyond certain limits. Haven Colony was rebuilt bigger and better than before, and the new facility housed children from dozens of species, including the few surviving Thrakari juveniles found hiding in the ruins of their civilization, and because in the end humanity had learned how to wage absolute war, and they had also learned that even monsters could choose to be better than their worst moments. But the galaxy would never forget what happened when someone made that choice for them. And the ruins of Thrakari world served as monuments to the price of targeting human innocence. And every alien child learned about Haven Colony and the war that followed, and the lesson was simple and clear and terrifying. And never hurt human children. Director Park often walked through the new orphanage and watched children from many species playing together and learning together and healing from traumas inflicted by adults who should have protected them. And he felt proud of what they had rebuilt, and he also felt the weight of what had been sacrificed to make it possible. The human capacity for both incredible compassion and absolute ruthlessness had been demonstrated beyond any doubt, and the galaxy was safer for innocence because potential aggressors understood the consequences of targeting them, but humanity had paid a price for that safety that would echo through their culture for generations. Late at night, when the children were sleeping peacefully under the protection of the most feared military in the galaxy, Director Park would stand at his window and look out at the stars and wonder if they had chosen correctly, and if the complete destruction of the Thrakari had been justice, or simply revenge dressed up in noble language, and if the children they had saved were worth the children who had died because of what humanity had become. The answers never came, but the questions remained, and they would remain as long as humans remembered what they had been capable of when someone pushed them beyond the limits of mercy and compassion, and the galaxy would remember too, and that memory would serve as protection for every innocent child among the stars. Human civilization continued and grew and prospered, and their worlds were safe and their children played without fear, and their enemies treated them with respect that bordered on terror, and they had achieved everything